The sound of gravel crunching under heavy boots was the only thing breaking the silence of the valley. Elias stopped, tilting his head slightly to the left. He couldn't see the gray clouds strangling the sun, nor the weeds choking the life out of his old porch, but he could smell the incoming snow. It smelled like iron and ozone. The air bit at his exposed skin, sharp and unforgiving, a reminder that nature didn't care about his blindness or his age. He was a man whose world had shrunk to the reach of his cane and the rhythmic breathing of the creature beside him. But even in the darkness, he knew he wasn't alone. Beside him, a low rumbling growl vibrated through the leather leash. Major, a retired Belgian Malinois with a coat scarred by service and eyes that had seen too much war, stood rigid. The dog wasn't just a guide. He was Elias's eyes, his shield, and the only heart that beat in sync with his own. Major pressed his warm flank against Elias's leg, a silent signal used in the field. Wait. Elias froze, his hand drifting to the knife on his belt. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the barn, sounding like a chorus of ghosts welcoming them home. But Major wasn't looking at the barn. The dog tugged sharply, not towards the safety of the house, but towards the jagged edge of the property where the land fell away into a treacherous ravine. "What is it, boy?" Elias whispered, his voice rough from this use. The dog didn't bark. He was too disciplined for that. He simply pulled with an urgency that Elias had never felt before. Trusting the animal more than his own intuition, the old man allowed himself to be dragged into the tall, freezing grass. The terrain was uneven, and every step was a gamble against a twisted ankle, but the dog moved with a calculated precision that kept Elias upright. But they were walking straight into a nightmare. They reached the lip of the ravine, and the smell hit Elias before the sound did. It was the copper scent of fresh blood mixed with the musk of fear. Below, trapped between sharp rocks, something large was thrashing weakly. Elias slid down carefully, guided by Major, until his hands brushed against coarse, matted fur. It was a horse. Its breathing was shallow, a rattle in its chest that spoke of a lung nearly frozen or crushed. Elias ran his hands over the animal's flank, feeling the jagged tear in the skin and the unnatural heat of infection fighting the cold. "Easy, easy now," Elias soothed, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. The horse let out a pained whinny, but didn't kick. It seemed to sense that the man touching it was broken too. Elias felt the animal's ribs. It was starving, left to die in a place where no one looked. He decided right then, in the freezing mud, that he would call him Phoenix, because if this creature was going to survive the night, it would have to rise from the ashes of its own pain. But saving a 1,000-pound animal when you can't see is a task for a madman, or a desperate one. Suddenly, the roar of a diesel engine shattered the moment. Tires spun on the ice above them, and heavy doors slammed. Harlan, the neighbor who had been trying to buy Elias's land for pennies since the day the old man lost his sight. Heavy footsteps crunched to the edge of the ravine. "I told you that beast was good for nothing," Harlan's voice dripped with disdain. "Put a bullet in it, Elias. Save yourself the trouble, and sign the papers and go rot in a nursing home where you belong." Elias stood up, facing the voice. He couldn't see the sneer on Harlan's face, but he could hear the arrogance. Major stepped in front of Elias, lips curling back to reveal white teeth, a silent weapon ready to deploy. "This horse," Elias started, his voice low but cutting through the wind, "is the missing piece. You don't sell family, Harlan, and you don't abandon soldiers." Harlan laughed, a dry, cruel sound. "Suit yourself, old man. The forecast says a blizzard of the century is hitting tonight. By morning, you, the dog, and that glue factory horse will be statues of ice." The truck drove away, leaving them in a silence that felt heavier than before. Harlan was right about one thing. The temperature was dropping fast. The wind wasn't whistling, it was screaming. Elias knew they couldn't stay in the ravine, but the farmhouse was too drafty, its windows long broken. He remembered the old root cellar, a concrete bunker built by his grandfather, buried into the side of the hill. It was their only chance. But moving a wounded horse through a blinding storm that was already beginning to obscure the world was a suicide mission. "Major, forward," Elias commanded. The dog barked once, sharp and clear. Together, they coaxed Pyrrhix up the slope. Every step was a battle. The horse stumbled, nearly crushing Elias, but Major was there, nudging the horse's legs, herding them with the instinct of a wolf. Snow began to fall, not softly, but in hard, stinging pellets. By the time they reached the heavy oak doors of the cellar, Elias's hands were numb, and his beard was frosted with ice. He shoved the doors open, the rusty hinges screaming in protest, and guided the group into the pitch-black abyss of the earth. The air inside was stale and smelled of ancient potatoes and damp earth, but it was out of the wind. Elias collapsed against the wall, his lungs burning. He thought they were safe. He thought the storm was the enemy they had to beat. But as he fumbled to light an old kerosene lantern he had left there years ago, Major didn't lay down. The dog stood facing the dark corner of the cellar, the hair on his spine standing straight up. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, deeper than before. Elias froze, the match burning down to his fingertips. They weren't alone in the dark. The flame seared Elias's fingertip, and he dropped the match with a hiss of pain. Total darkness swallowed the cellar, but the sound that followed was clearer than any image. It was the wet, guttural snarl of a mountain lion, cornered and desperate. Before Elias could even reach for his knife, the air exploded with violence. Major didn't bark, he launched himself. The sound of 80 pounds of muscle colliding with the predator echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot. Elias backed up against the rough stone, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, listening to the chaotic dance of claws and teeth in the pitch black. He felt useless, a soldier stripped of his weapon, forced to listen to his best friend fight a war alone in the dark. A sickening thud shook the ground, followed by a high-pitched yelp that tore through Elias's soul. Then, a dragging sound, the scramble of claws on stone, and finally, the heavy wooden door slammed shut by the force of a retreating body. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. "Major?" Elias whispered, his voice trembling. He waited for a whimper, a sign of defeat. Instead, he felt a wet nose press firmly against his hand. The dog was panting heavily, and Elias could smell the iron tang of blood. He didn't know whose, but Major was standing. The dog had cleared the room with the ruthless efficiency of a warrior. But as Elias ran his hands over the dog's thick fur, he felt a deep gash on the shoulder. Major didn't flinch. He simply leaned into the touch, silently telling his master that the perimeter was secure. But the danger was far from over. The temperature in the cellar was dropping. The adrenaline faded, leaving Elias shivering violently. The blizzard outside was finding every crack and crevice in the old foundation. If he didn't seal this tomb, it would become their grave by morning. "We have work to do, buddy," Elias muttered, fighting the lethargy that was beginning to cloud his mind. He crawled across the floor, feeling for the piles of ancient rotting hay in the corners. He found a patch of damp earth where the wall leaked, mixing the dirt with the straw to create a thick, primitive mortar. His hands were numb, clumsy blocks of ice, but he worked with a manic desperation. He packed the mud into the gaps around the door frame and the vents, his breath forming clouds he couldn't see. Every movement was agony. His joints screamed, and his old war injuries flared up like fire. Phoenix, the horse, watched them from the corner, his large, dark eyes reflecting the non-existent light. The animal seemed to understand the effort. He lowered his head, breathing warm air onto Elias's frozen neck as the old man worked near him. It was a small gesture, a spark of gratitude in the freezing dark.
Elias paused, resting his forehead against the horse's velvet nose. "We're going to make it," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he was lying. But he still had no idea that the cold was about to trigger something worse than frostbite. Hours bled into one another. The cellar warmed up slightly, trapping the body heat of the three survivors, but Elias was burning up. A fever, sudden and vicious, seized him. It wasn't just the cold, it was the exhaustion of a lifetime catching up. He curled up on a pile of dry hay, shivering uncontrollably. The darkness of the cellar began to shift. He wasn't in a farmhouse basement anymore. He was back in the jungle 40 years ago. The smell of mold became the smell of napalm. The wind outside became the scream of mortars. "Incoming!" Elias shouted, thrashing in the hay, swinging his arms at enemies that weren't there. "Get down! They're everywhere!" He tried to stand, to run into the storm, convinced he had to save his platoon. He was halfway to the door, ready to tear down the mud seals he had just built, when a heavy weight slammed into his chest. Major. The dog stood on his hind legs, paws planted squarely on Elias's shoulders, pushing him back down. Elias struggled, shouting names of men long dead. "Let me go! I have to get them!" But Major didn't budge. The dog let out a sharp, commanding bark, then laid his entire body weight across Elias's chest, pinning him to the ground. The pressure was grounding. Major licked Elias's face, the rough tongue scraping away the hallucinations. The dog's heartbeat thudded against Elias's own, slow, steady, real. "Major?" Elias gasped, the fog clearing for a second. The dog whined softly, resting his heavy head on Elias's neck. He was absorbing the old man's panic, acting as an anchor in the storm of his mind. Major wasn't just protecting him from the world, he was protecting Elias from himself. Elias wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the fur, and wept. He cried for the years lost, for the sight he'd never get back, and for the sheer, terrifying beauty of being loved this much by a beast. When the fever broke, it was the sound of chewing that woke him. Elias sat up, weak but clear-headed. He reached out. Phoenix was eating the clean hay Elias had set aside. The horse was standing on his own. The poultice of mud and herbs Elias had applied to the wounds earlier had held. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Elias rasped. He crawled over, flanked by Major, and the three of them sat close together, man, dog, and horse, huddled in a pile of warmth against the cruel indifference of winter. Elias realized then that he hadn't saved the horse. The horse and the dog were keeping him alive. He listened to the wind outside. It had changed pitch. It was no longer a scream, but a low, mournful moan. The worst of the storm was passing, but they were trapped under feet of snow. Elias checked his supplies. They had no water left. He knew that dehydration would kill the horse before hunger did. He had to make a choice. He stood up, his legs trembling, and moved toward the door. He had to dig them out. He placed his hand on the latch, but it wouldn't move. Ice had sealed them from the outside. They were buried alive.
Panic is a cold hand that squeezes the throat, but Elias had lived with panic long enough to know its rhythm. He forced his breathing to slow. He felt the door again. It wasn't just the latch. A wall of snow had drifted against the exit, packing it tight like concrete. He was not strong enough to move it, not alone, but he remembered the leverage of the old days on the farm. He fumbled in the darkness until his fingers curled around the cold, rusted iron of a crowbar left in the corner. He jammed it into the crack of the door frame, but he needed force, weight. "Phoenix!" Elias called softly. The horse shifted, his hooves clacking on the stone. Elias grabbed the horse's halter and guided him toward the door. He placed his hand on the animal's massive shoulder and tapped the wood. "Push, boy, push!" It was a gamble. A panicked horse in a small space could crush him. But Phoenix wasn't just an animal anymore. He was part of the pack. Major sensed the plan. The dog stood by the crack in the door and barked, a rhythmic, driving sound. The horse leaned forward. Elias threw his entire body weight onto the crowbar. "No!" The wood groaned. The horse grunted, his muscles coiling and releasing a wave of power. With a sound like a gunshot, the frozen seal shattered. The door flew outward, and an avalanche of white powder spilled into the cellar. But beyond the snow, there was something else. Clean, crisp air. Elias scrambled up the drift, his lungs greedy for the oxygen. He broke the surface. The wind had died. The silence was absolute, heavy and holy. He couldn't see the blinding white landscape that stretched for miles, sparkling under the morning sun, but he could feel the warmth on his face. Major bounded out into the snow with the joy of a puppy, shaking the white dust from his coat. Then came Phoenix. The horse stepped out carefully, lifting his head high, and let out a loud, defiant whinny that echoed across the valley. They were alive. 2 days later, the sound of Harlan's truck returned. He didn't drive up to the house. He parked at the property line, wading through the knee-deep snow toward the barn, likely expecting to find frozen carcasses to report to sanitation. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Elias was sitting on the repaired porch, polishing his boots. Major lay at his feet, his bandaged shoulder rising and falling in peaceful sleep. And in the paddock, which Elias had cleared of snow by hand, Phoenix was walking. The horse was thin, yes, and scarred, but he was moving with a grace that Harlan had sworn was impossible. Harlan walked up to the porch, taking off his hat. For a long time, he said nothing. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a confused respect. "I brought some oats," Harlan said finally, his voice quiet. "For the beast." He placed a sack on the steps. "And I know a vet who owes me a favor. He can come by tomorrow." Elias turned his face toward the sun, a small smile playing on his lips. "Keep your vet, Harlan. We heal our own here. And keep your money. The land isn't for sale." Harlan looked at the blind man, then at the three-legged dog who had killed the mountain lion and the horse that had cheated death. He nodded once, a silent surrender, and walked away. He knew when he was beaten. He knew that you couldn't buy something that had been forged in fire and ice. In the months that followed, the ruins of the farm changed. Elias used his hands to see what his eyes couldn't. He rebuilt the fences, not to keep things out, but to keep them safe. Word spread in the town, not about the crazy blind hermit, but about the man who could fix broken things. Soon, others came. A dog deemed too aggressive for adoption. A donkey with a bad leg. People who felt just as broken as the animals they brought. Elias and Major didn't just build a farm, they built a sanctuary. They renamed the property the Second Chance. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in colors Elias remembered from his youth, he stood by the fence, stroking Phoenix's mane. Major sat beside him, leaning his weight against Elias's leg. The ghosts of the war were still there, sometimes, but they were quieter now. They couldn't scream over the sound of life that filled the farm. Elias realized that Harlan had been wrong about everything. He wasn't waiting to die. He had been waiting for a reason to live. He understood now that we are all just pieces of a puzzle, scattered in the dark, waiting for the right storm to push us together. "Come on, Major," Elias whispered, turning back toward the warm light of the house. "Let's go home." Sometimes the only way to find yourself is to lose everything first.
And sometimes, saving a life is the only way to save your own. If this story moved you, don't forget to leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe for more stories that touch the soul. See you in the next video.